Hello, I'm Eric Huang. You're listening to Saint Podcast, an historical and cultural exploration of the often controversial and always fascinating lives of the saints. This is a prelude to Saint Podcast Season 2, which is all about mystics, saints who had transcendental experiences with God. Most of these saints had divine visitations with heavenly as well as infernal beings. Many were scholars and writers who greatly influenced the modern face of Christianity. Some were recluses and chose a life of self-deprivation to be closer to God. Others had divine superpowers. These are the stories from Saint Podcast Season 2, Mystics. The term mystic is difficult to pin down. Clerics and scholars have debated what a mystic is and the very validity of mystics and mysticism since records began. The broadest definition would categorize any spiritual experience involving an altered state or consciousness as mystical. Narrower definitions limit mystical experiences to those that are transformative or lead to a transcendental union, a oneness between the human and a divine being. In Christian mysticism, this is often manifested through visions of or from God. These aren't dreams, but waking experiences that have physical substance. They have taste, smell, and sound, as well as visuals. Sometimes the experiences can be pleasurable, an ecstasy. Other times they can be terrifying and unimaginably painful. Visions granted to Christian mystics have portended future events and also acted as a command to fulfill a destiny. Saint Podcast's focus will be on Christian mystics, but mysticism is far older than Christianity and has a vast diversity of traditions and definitions around the world and through time. Christian mysticism is a descendant of Jewish mysticism, which makes sense since Christianity began as an offshoot of Judaism. Jewish mysticism was in turn influenced by Greek practices. The Greek root word mystikos simply identified an initiate into one of the many cults of gods in the ancient polytheistic religions of the region. There was nothing transcendental or transformative to the word or to the person it identified. Jewish mysticism changed this with a focus on visions. In particular, the visions reported in the book of Ezekiel, an ancient Jewish text that also forms part of the Christian Old Testament. The prophet Ezekiel saw a chariot driven by an angelic figure called a Hayat. The Hayat had, quote, the likeness of a man and sat on a sapphire throne. The chariot itself was made of living divine beings. Another type of angel called a cherubim. Cherubim is where we get the word cherub from. They had 2 pairs of wings, 4 wings in total. They too were human-like, but they each had 4 faces, that of a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, one each facing east, south, north, west. If this mix of animal heads sounds familiar, it's because each of these creatures corresponds to one of the evangelists in the New Testament. We discussed this last season in episode 8, St. Christopher, the dog-headed giant. In Ezekiel's vision, the human face of each cherub always faced east and looked up at the Hayat, the driver. 4 cherubs made up the body of the chariot, forming a box-like structure with 1 pair of wings touching the wings of the angels on either side. The second pair of wings was brought in close to the angel's body, covering it. Other angels called Ophanim formed the chariot's wheels. In art, they look like balls of eyes and wings, or fiery rings. Lastly, a 4th type of angel, called a seraphim, with 3 pairs of wings, fueled the chariot. Their name means the burning one, a reference to the flame of faith. It's this fire from the seraphs that propelled the chariot, allowing its supernatural motion, continuously ascending and descending. Have a look at stpodcast.com to see artists' interpretations of this vision and the various types of angels. Jewish mysticism stemmed from the meditation on Ezekiel's vision. Other visions, called apocalypses, that revealed arcane knowledge, were also central to the practice. These were often a behind-the-scenes peek at the glories of the seven heavens, from the ranks of angels that dwelt there to the fire and lightning that encircled each layer. The general public wasn't usually allowed access to mystical activities or revelations. It was thought that interested parties needed a basic grounding, also guidance, before being allowed to go further for fear of misinterpretation leading to blasphemy. It's within this Jewish tradition that Christian mysticism evolved. For early Christians, mysticism was defined in three parts: the biblical, or the secret hidden meanings to biblical scripture; the liturgical, which referred directly to the ritual of Mass and the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharistic rite; and thirdly, the spiritual or contemplative, which is a personal experiential relationship with God, often granted whilst in an altered state of consciousness. It's this spiritual or contemplative mysticism, expressed as hyper-real visions, that inspired the mystic Joan of Arc to take up arms during the 100 Years' War. These types of visions often forever change the witness of the divine experience, making them feel much closer to God, who then grants an understanding that was impossible before the mystical event. An example of this is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He was a cleric who greatly affected the politics of early 12th century Europe. One of his many legacies is his Mariology, a treatise on the person and status of the Virgin Mary. According to Saint Bernard's hagiography, he was praying one afternoon in the year 1146 before a sculpture of the Virgin Mary at the Speyer Cathedral in Germany. While meditating on the nature of the Virgin Mary, the sculpture suddenly came to life. The Virgin Mary adjusted her garment and exposed one breast. She squeezed it. A jet of milk filled Bernard's mouth. It's this milk that he received mystically that granted Bernard the wisdom required to complete the Mariology. This might seem strange or even absurd today, but receiving wisdom mystically through the milk of a higher or more enlightened being was not an uncommon concept in classical or medieval times. There are many legends about the Virgin Mary and how she cured ailments and imparted knowledge through her breast milk, imbued with mystical properties from God in heaven. Mystical visions aren't always heavenly, though. In the Apocalypse of Peter, a 2nd century Greek text written by an unknown author, the apostle St. Peter is granted nightmarish visions of sinners being horrifically punished in hell. The scenes are especially difficult for modern readers because the punishments are outrageously out of step with the severity of the crimes committed. Most of the infractions aren't even considered crimes today. St. Peter's terrifying visions in the Apocalypse are a reflection of the anachronistic sensibilities that produced the texts. They're doubly terrifying to modern readers for this very reason. Visions of the terrifying kind can also include battling the devil. Last season, we met St. Margaret, who was swallowed by a dragon that turned out to be the devil in disguise. Mystical saints like Peter the Exorcist and Antony of Egypt also physically fought the devil and extracted various devils and demons from the possessed by performing exorcisms. The mystic St. Padre Pio, a 20th century saint who died in 1968, was said to have been attacked by the devil. Here are his own words to his confessor, Padre Agostino, shortly before his death.
Now 22 days have passed since Jesus allowed the devils to vent their anger on me. My Father, my whole body is bruised from the beatings that I've received to the present time by our enemies. Several times they've even torn off my shirt so that they could strike at my exposed flesh.
Padre Pio's wounds have been documented, though not attested by any independent sources. Most of his mystical experiences were excruciatingly painful. One example is transverberation, literally a piercing of the heart, a love dart which burns with the love of God. Here is an excerpt from a letter Padre Pio wrote to a colleague, Padre Benedetto, about his transverberation.
While I was hearing the boys' confessions on the 5th, I was suddenly terrorized by the sight of a celestial person who presented himself to my mind's eye. He had in his hand a sort of weapon, like a long, short-pointed steel blade which seemed to emit fire. At the very instant that I saw this, I saw that person hurl the weapon into my soul with all his might. I cried out with difficulty and felt I was dying. This agony lasted uninterruptedly until the morning of the 7th. I cannot tell you how much I suffered during this period of anguish. Even my entrails were torn and ruptured by the weapon, and nothing was spared. From that day on, I've been mortally wounded. I feel in the depths of my soul a wound that's always open and which causes me continual agony.
Saint Teresa of Avila was also afflicted with transverberation. She saw an angel pierce her with a burning arrow. It plunged so deep into her body that she felt her entrails being pulled out. And though St. Teresa's experience equals Padre Pio's in its level of unimaginable pain, hers was also coupled with unimaginable pleasure, a divine ecstasy. We'll delve deeper into St. Teresa's legend this season. Transverberation wasn't the end of Padre Pio's suffering. He also had stigmata, the bloody wounds of Christ's crucifixion that miraculously and painfully appeared all over his body. Here's another excerpt from a letter Padre Pio wrote to the same Padre Benedetto.
Then, last night, something happened which I can neither explain nor understand. In the middle of my palms, a red mark appeared, about the size of a penny, accompanied by acute pain in the middle of the red marks. The pain was more pronounced in the middle of the left hand, so much so that I can still feel it. Under my feet, I can feel some pain.
Biographer Reverend Charles Mortimer Carty noted in 1968 that Padre Pio's wound smelled of, quote, violets, lilies, roses, incense, or even fresh tobacco. Padre Pio's stigmata were examined by various clerics through the decades, though he never consented to medical tests. The stigmata were and remain controversial. The Catholic Church is still split between those who believe the wounds to be miraculous and mystical, and others, such as the founder of Milan's Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, who deem them to be symptoms of a, quote, self-mutilating psychopath. We will explore stigmata, transverberation, and exorcism in several episodes later this season. Another mystic, Maria Esperanza Bianchini, who was a world away in Venezuela, predicted Padre Pio's death. She had a vision in which Padre Pio delivered this message.
I've come to say goodbye. My time has come. It's your turn.
In the vision, Padre Pio bids Maria farewell and passes the torch to her as his successor. Maria's husband, who witnessed her trance-like state, remarked that her face became Padre Pio's face whilst she was enwrapped by the vision. Soon after, those who knew Maria reported seeing her levitate during Mass. Witnesses also came forward claiming Maria had the power of bilocation, being in more than one place at the same time. Padre Pio was said to have had these same divine powers. Spiritual or contemplative mysticism is the stuff of Gothic novels. Beyond these horror and ghost story tropes, however, is the biblical mysticism involved in unlocking the hidden secrets in Scripture. The ever-changing demographics, cultural practices, and sensibilities of believers necessitated the deep, mystical study of the Bible to determine how this book, composed nearly 2,000 years ago, related to later developments, both cultural and technological, like the worship of relics, whether it was sinful to create non-religious art, how to deal with Protestants, the printing press, and deeply controversial topics like colonization, slavery, same-sex marriage, divorce. The doctors of the Church, 32 men and 4 women who greatly influenced the development and doctrine of the Church, are all arguably biblical mystics because of their deep connection with God and Scripture. It's through mystical experiences with texts from the Bible that they effected dogmatic change in everyday practices in the Church. Theologians like St. Augustine may not have had the power to levitate, but the inspiration behind writing City of God or any number of his treatises would have been seen by contemporaries as divinely inspired, coming directly from God, and therefore mystical. St. Podcast Season 2 will cover Christian mysticism, highlighting 10 of the most well-known and prestigious mystics. All of them are historically attested figures. Some were doctors of the Church. Across 10 episodes, we'll meet the founder of a monastic order who suffered from stigmata. We'll explore the legend of a nun who would fall into sudden ecstatic states of joy and levitate. We'll meet a hermit whose constant companion was a lion. And we'll hear stories about saints who fought demons and the devil himself through exorcisms. Tune in to St. Podcast Season 2, Mystics. Thank you so much for listening to this preview of our second season. It's all about mystics, saints who had transcendental experiences with God. Special thanks to my friend Matt Murphy, who provided the readings for this episode. You can follow him on Instagram at MattMurphyNYC. That's MattMurphyNYC. For images of the people and themes mentioned, please go to stpodcast.com and have a look at our social media pages on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have any comments or questions, please email us at feedback@stpodcast.com. The word saint is spelled out, SAINT. And if you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Rate us and leave a review. It'll help other people find the program. The first episode in our Mystic series will cover a saint who's been called the father of all monks. He's the patron saint of animals, gravediggers, farmers, and basket makers. He's also the patron of skin diseases and has a skin disease named after him. This saint spent most of his life alone in the desert with a raven and a half-human, half-goat satyr as occasional companions. He also encountered a centaur who turned out to be the devil in disguise. Tune in next time for the story of St. Anthony of Egypt, the mystic in the desert.